They brought their weapons with them. This shotgun, this dagger.
You watched them say goodnight to each other for years. You trusted them like family. But the stars of the Waltons lived lives that would shock you. One actress ran away at 15 and stood inches from flying knives in a traveling carnival. Another fought through alcoholism while pretending to be America's perfect father. And one beloved cast member died after a misdiagnosis that a simple X-ray might have caught. The mountain was peaceful. The people who lived on it were not. This is what really happened to the stars who aren't around anymore. Geer. Geer, the man everyone knew as Grandpa Walton, carried a life that moved in ways no one saw on the screen. He stepped into the 1930s with a strong voice and stronger beliefs. He cared about workers, about civil rights, about people who had no one to defend them. That passion pulled him toward the Communist Party USA, not for power, but for the hope of a fair world. When Hollywood entered the dark years of the McCarthy era, he was one of the names they circled. By 1951, when the House Committee on Un-American Activities demanded actors to accuse others, the fear in the industry was everywhere. Careers vanished. Families were torn apart. But when it was Will's turn to speak, he refused. He said he would not betray his friends or his beliefs. He knew what it meant the moment he walked out. The doors of Hollywood shut on him. Jobs disappeared. Money dried up. And for more than 10 years, he survived outside the world he had worked so hard to enter. During that long exile, there was one project he still believed in. It was the 1954 film Salt of the Earth, created by blacklisted artists who refused to stay silent. It was a pro-union drama the government tried to stop at every step. Theaters were pressured not to show it. Distributors avoided it. It almost disappeared. Yet Will stayed with it because he believed the story mattered. Decades later, in 1992, it was added to the National Film Registry, long after the people who tried to silence it had moved on. The film stood as proof that his choices, painful as they were, came from something real inside him. His public battles were already heavy, but his private life carried its own weight. Long before he married Herta Ware, he had a deep relationship with Harry Hay, a man who would later become a pioneer of LGBTQ rights in America. Harry founded the Mattachine Society in 1950, one of the first major gay rights organizations in the country. Their relationship lasted for years, and the bond between them never fully faded, even after Will chose marriage and family. At a time when being openly gay meant losing everything, he kept that part of his life hidden, not because he was ashamed, but because the world around him was not safe. Even so, he continued to support Harry and helped early activists find places to meet, talk, and plan. The secrecy created tension that followed him through the decades, and he was not alone in that struggle. His co-star, Ellen Corby, lived with similar fear while hiding her own long-term same-sex relationship. When the world finally saw him as Grandpa Walton, gentle and full of wisdom, they had no idea how much he had lived through. He carried every moment quietly, but his life kept moving. And in April 1978, when he was 76, his final moments arrived in Los Angeles. His family gathered around him, singing folk songs he had loved since his activist days. "This Land Is Your Land" filled the room, along with poems by Robert Frost. The man who had fought so many silent battles slipped away, surrounded by the voices he cherished. His ashes were placed in the Shakespeare Garden at the Theatricum Botanicum, a theater he had built in Topanga Canyon after Hollywood pushed him out. That space became a home for actors, dreamers, and people who needed a place where art and freedom could breathe together. When the Waltons wrote his character's death into the episode The Empty Nest in 1978, the grief the audience felt was real because the cast was grieving too. They weren't just losing a character. They were losing the man who had lived a life full of courage, quiet rebellion, and gentle strength. Ellen Corby. Ellen Corby had spent her whole life building a steady place in Hollywood. So when she stepped onto the set of The Waltons as Grandma Esther Walton, she carried a quiet strength that everyone felt around her. That is why what happened in October 1976 shook the entire show. She didn't arrive for work that morning, and at first people thought she might be running late. But as more time passed, a strange worry began to spread. Co-stars and producers drove to her home to check on her, and the moment they walked inside, everything stopped. She was lying on the floor, unable to move or call out. A massive stroke had hit her without warning and changed her life in a single moment. Doctors said she was lucky to survive, but survival did not mean safety. The stroke left her with a heavy weakness on one side of her body and took away her clear speech, something she had relied on for more than 40 years in the industry. She suddenly found herself trapped in a body that no longer obeyed her, and the fear that followed was bigger than any pain she felt. She knew the business she worked in. She knew how fast studios moved on, and she knew that CBS already worried her condition might slow down production or affect the flow of the show. Even while she was healing, a cold thought stayed with her. She believed she might never return as Grandma again. While she spent that time recovering, the show had to find a way to continue. Writers avoided revealing too much. They quietly explained her absence by saying Grandma was in the hospital, keeping the story gentle, because no one knew if Ellen would ever walk back onto that set. The silence around her illness only made the uncertainty heavier, and she later admitted that she was almost sure her time on the series was over. But Ellen didn't stop. She fought for every movement, every word, every simple step toward feeling like herself again. And as months turned into seasons, something inside her refused to let go of the character she loved. In 1978, she finally returned to the set. Everyone saw how hard she had worked. Her body still carried the weight of the stroke, and her speech was softer and slower. Yet there was a spark in her eyes that had not faded. Writers shaped Grandma's story around her real condition, giving her shorter lines and gentle phrases like, "Pray, pray, pray." It wasn't a limitation. It became a part of who Grandma was, a quiet reminder of how much she had survived. Ralph Waite. Ralph Waite had a way of filling a screen with calm strength, but the life behind that gentle presence moved through storms, bold choices, and moments that shook both Hollywood and the people who worked beside him. When The Waltons reached its peak in 1975, fans thought everything behind the scenes was just as peaceful as the mountain they watched every week. Instead, Ralph reached a point where he felt something had to change. He walked off the set and refused to return for the first 2 episodes of the new season. His salary was $3,750 per episode, and he wanted $15,000. It was a jump that made CBS furious. The network's president, Robert D. Wood, even went public and said they would no longer tolerate demands that felt unreasonable. There were threats of legal action and headlines everywhere, and people wondered if Ralph had pushed too far. But he stayed firm. It took intense talks and a lot of pressure on both sides before he finally came back. Even then, the whole event hung in the air as a warning about what could happen when an actor challenged a major network. That boldness wasn't something new in him. It was shaped years earlier when he worked at a church in Garden City, New York. He believed deeply in civil rights, and in the 1960s he urged his congregation to support an NAACP boycott. Only 2 people showed up. The lack of support broke something inside him. He walked away from that life and moved into a farmhouse in Connecticut to think about who he wanted to be. From there, he leaned into activism, speaking out against the war, standing up for people who felt unseen, and putting his voice wherever he thought it could help. It was a side of him the public rarely saw, but it lived quietly underneath every character he played. His personal life carried its own weight. He married 3 times and fought his way through alcoholism until he found sobriety. That journey became a quiet thread that connected him with his co-star Michael Learned. They leaned on each other and tried to stay steady, because they knew millions of families looked at them like America's parents. Their off-screen battles and their shared recovery created a strength that held them together for years. When Ralph died on February 13, 2014, at the age of 85, tributes came from every direction. People who had worked with him described him as warm and sincere. Fans remembered John Walton Sr., but those who knew him felt the loss of a man whose life stood on courage and gentle conviction. Joe Conley. Joe Conley's story slipped through Hollywood in a different way. Viewers saw Ike Godsey as the soft-spoken storekeeper who seemed to belong on Walton's Mountain forever. But the path that led him there held more twists than anyone expected. Before he ever stood in front of a camera, he stood in a war zone during the Korean War. He was seriously wounded, and that wound stayed with him long after he returned home. It shaped the way he looked at life and the choices he made once he stepped back into the world. Hollywood didn't come first for him. Real estate did. He built 3 successful agencies in Los Angeles by the early 1970s, and the money from that life meant acting could stay a passion instead of a desperate pursuit. He balanced both worlds at once, running businesses while filming a hit show, and that balance gave him a rare kind of freedom. When he wrote his autobiography in 2009, he finally opened up about all of it in Ike Godsey of Walton's Mountain, a book that showed how much he had lived outside the frame of a TV episode. Yet fame didn't protect him from heartbreak. The cheerful smile people loved slowly faded as dementia took hold in his final years. His wife, Louise, later shared that he spent his last days in a care facility where the disease grew stronger until it finally took his life on July 7, 2013, at age 85. Many fans never knew he was suffering. He had always been private, and the people around him kept his decline out of the public eye because they wanted his legacy to stay protected. It was a painful ending for someone who had given so much joy to millions. Joe left something behind that didn't disappear with him. His autobiography held the full weight of his life: the bravery, the humor, the war, the businesses, and the years of storytelling that made so many families feel at home. People remember his gentle presence on screen, but the real man behind Ike Godsey lived a life filled with resilience, work, loss, and quiet strength. Ronnie Clare Edwards. Ronnie Clare Edwards, the unforgettable Corabeth Walton Godsey from the Waltons, lived a life that kept moving in ways her viewers never imagined. People knew her for that sharp tongue and that bossy charm, yet her own story stretched far beyond those scenes. It carried twists and secret adventures that seemed almost too bold to be true. Even as a young girl, she wanted more than an ordinary life, and at 15, she simply walked away from home and joined a traveling carnival. She started at the bottom, taking tickets and learning how things worked, then slowly found herself beside the knife thrower. In her memoir, The Knife Thrower's Assistant, she wrote about standing strapped to a spinning wheel and feeling real knives slice the air close to her skin. She never forgot the rush of that moment. The only reason she lost the job was a ragweed allergy that made her sneeze at the worst possible times. She joked that no knife thrower wants an assistant who might sneeze mid-spin. That chapter of her life stayed with her, and years later, she shaped it into a one-woman stage show and performed it at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival in 1993, where the audience watched her story unfold with a kind of breathless attention. Her life kept shifting and stretching, and Dallas became another colorful chapter. After selling her Los Angeles mansion to flee from the Red Hot Chili Peppers in 2008, she moved back to Dallas with a kind of fresh spark. There, she took an old 1911 Catholic church and turned it into her home. The building had once carried hymns and quiet prayers, and she filled it with art, writing, music, and long conversations. She wrote plays, hosted gatherings for artists and writers, and became part of the creative heartbeat of the city. Her memoir reached people in the same way. It wasn't just stories from the Waltons, but pieces of her life in Oklahoma, memories of strange moments, family roots, and the eerie humor she loved. Her friend Fanny Flagg called it Oklahoma Gothic because it carried shadows and warmth at the same time. Ronnie Clare Edwards died in her sleep on June 14, 2016, at 83 from chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Her longtime friend and business partner, Marty Van Cleek, stayed close to her during those final days. Mary McDonough, who played Erin Walton, said she was larger than life, and people who knew her felt that was true. She left behind more than a character on a screen. She left a trail of bold choices, unforgettable performances, and a voice that filled every space she entered. John Ritter. John Ritter's life moved in a way most people never saw, and when you follow it closely, everything starts to connect in a quiet but gripping way. People knew him as the charming and slightly nervous Reverend Matthew Fordwick on the Waltons in the early 1970s, and they held on to that image because it felt warm and safe. But behind that smile and gentle voice, there were moments that cut far deeper than anyone imagined. Moments he never turned into stories. Moments that stayed hidden behind the characters he played. Long before fame found him, something happened that changed how he saw the world, literally and emotionally. He was a teenager riding in a car with the windows down, enjoying a simple moment when something sharp flew in without warning. It might have been a rock or some flying piece of debris. Whatever it was, it struck him in his right eye with so much force that it damaged more than the doctors could repair. He lost most of the vision in that eye and was left with only the edges, the kind of sight that makes the world look distant on one side. His pupil stayed different for the rest of his life, and he learned to navigate life with a kind of quiet adjustment that people around him never noticed. It happened long before cameras followed him, but the weight of it stayed with him. Years later, after he had become a familiar face on television, another moment arrived that changed everything again, and this time, it came without mercy. On September 11, 2003, while he was rehearsing for 8 simple rules for dating, my teenage daughter, he suddenly felt a tearing pain in his chest. It came fast and sharp, the kind of pain that steals your breath and leaves you confused. He was rushed to Providence St. Joseph Medical Center in Burbank, a place he knew well because it was right across from the studio. Doctors hurried to treat him. They believed he was having a heart attack, so they followed the usual steps, using aspirin and anticoagulants to open blocked arteries. No one realized that this treatment was working against him, not helping him. The truth came too late. What was really happening inside him was an aortic dissection, a rare and deadly condition where the inner layer of the aorta tears open and blood forces its way between the layers. By the time the doctors recognized the mistake and rushed him into surgery, the damage had gone too far. Reports later said his aorta looked shredded. He died at 10:48 that night, only 6 days before he would have turned 55. It shocked the world because people had watched him laugh and move and glow only hours earlier. His death left his widow, Amy Yazbek, carrying a sadness that pushed her into a long fight she hoped would bring answers. She filed a $67 million wrongful death lawsuit against the hospital and 2 doctors, arguing that a simple chest X-ray could have pointed them toward the right diagnosis. The case dragged on for years, carrying both grief and unanswered questions. In 2020, a jury ruled that the doctors were not at fault, saying the condition moved too fast and was too rare for even experts to catch in time. Louis Arquette. Louis Arquette was known to many as J.D. Pickett from the Waltons, the warm man who seemed steady and familiar on screen, but his real life moved in a way that kept shifting under his feet. As people watched him play a calm father figure, he carried stories that were far more tangled and surprising. He came from a famous Hollywood family, yet his own journey kept breaking away from what people expected. His father was Cliff Arquette, the comedian everyone knew as Charlie Weaver, but Louis wanted his own identity. So he became a man who could act, play music, make people laugh, and even bring puppets to life when a scene needed something extra. During the 1970s, he ran the Second City Theater in Chicago, a place that shaped generations of comedians. Soon after, he moved his whole family to a suburban commune in Virginia. His wife later called it a hippie commune because life there felt loose and different and full of moments that pulled the Arquettes into an unconventional rhythm. His personal life stretched between love and heavy loss. His wife, Brenda Olivia Marty Arquette, battled breast cancer until she passed away in 1997, and that changed him in ways he didn't speak about often. She was Jewish and the daughter of a Holocaust refugee, while Louis had been raised Catholic. Somewhere along his path, he converted to Islam, a choice he kept mostly private, yet it signaled how deeply he searched for meaning. After her death, he turned inward. He spent most of his time with his children, the ones who would later become well-known themselves. Rosanna, Patricia, David, Alexis, and Richmond carried the Arquette name into movies and television, but inside the family, things were not always smooth. There were stories of addiction, emotional wounds, and public fights. And through all of it, people often said Louis tried to keep everyone steady, even while his own heart was heavy. His career after the Waltons moved in many directions. He stepped into major films like The China Syndrome and Tango and Cash, and later appeared in Waiting for Guffman, where his humor fit perfectly. He even lent his voice to video games when new opportunities appeared. But while he worked and kept adding new roles to his life, his body carried its own troubles. Heart issues followed him for years, and they became harder to manage as time passed. He tried to ease the pressure with nightlife ventures and wild midlife adventures, opening nightclubs and throwing himself into chaotic fun that often ended up in tabloids. People saw the surface and thought he was losing control, but underneath, he was trying to cope with grief, with shifting faith, with the weight of a family always in the spotlight. On February 10, 2001, his heart finally gave out. He was 65. His story left behind more than people expected. It showed a man full of talent, someone who kept creating even when life pulled him in painful directions. It also showed how much quiet struggle can hide behind a familiar smile. Mary Jackson, who played Miss Emily Baldwin on The Waltons, always carried a warmth that made people feel safe. Yet her real life held far more twists than most viewers ever imagined. When people think of Emily, they picture the shy sister with her hidden bottles of the recipe and her soft voice that carried a lifetime of longing for Ashley Longworth. But once you move past that gentle screen presence, you find a woman who shaped nearly 50 years of television and theater with a quiet determination that never asked for applause. Her journey never rushed. It unfolded slowly, step by step, like she knew the world would eventually notice her if she simply stayed steady. She stepped into the role of Emily in 1972, when she was already 61. By then, she had lived through decades of auditions and rehearsals and late nights working on scripts. She had already appeared on Alfred Hitchcock Presents, My Three Sons, and The Andy Griffith Show. Each job taught her something new and added another layer to her craft. Even so, she had no idea that The Waltons would be the show that finally made people stop and say they knew her. Fans loved her so deeply that they often stopped her to ask if Ashley ever returned. The fact that she could make viewers feel that invested said everything about how she carried the role. What people rarely mention is that she had once been offered the role of Alice Horton on Days of Our Lives during an unaired pilot. The part eventually went to Frances Reed, and Mary moved forward without bitterness. That was how she handled most things. If something slipped away, she kept walking. She trusted that something else was waiting. And when Emily Baldwin arrived, that trust finally paid off. The character became unforgettable because Mary gave her a softness that felt real and an ache that felt lived in. Her personal life held a different kind of story. She married Griffin Bancroft Jr. in 1937, believing that chapter would last. But the marriage ended, and instead of searching for someone new, she chose a life shaped by her own terms. The spinster label never bothered her. She filled her years with work and friends and moments that mattered to her. As time moved on, she stayed committed to her craft. She kept acting well into her 90s and made her final appearance in A Walton Easter in 1997. Every time she stepped onto a set, she carried the same steady focus she had in her early years. Her last chapter grew harder. Parkinson's disease slowly chipped away at the strength she once carried with such ease. Still, she held on with quiet grace. On December 10, 2005, at the age of 95, she left behind a legacy built not on fame or dramatic headlines, but on consistency, skill, and the power of showing up again and again.